Northwest Washington, and I work for the Department of Natural Resources in the Forest Stewardship group with Matt Preventure, who I understand you've already heard give a webinar or two about site preparation and tree planting, which is perfect setup for this one. And so we work with small landowners all around the state. So this presentation is just focused particularly on animal damage to trees, and mostly emphasizing animal damage to smaller trees, because that's where we tend to have our issues with the critters in our trees. So let's see if there we go. You are here. State of Washington is about 2/3 naturally forested with tremendous amount of variability, you know, with the Cascades crest down the middle and the wetter forest and the really wet forest over here, and your interesting rain shadow, kind of wet forest here, you know, ponderosa pine, dry forest here, Northeast Washington, funky ponderosa pine, frozen forest, but a lot of forest, and interestingly, very similar fauna across most of it. And so we have similar issues in regard to animal damage on trees across the state. So this is a plug for our program. There's about 4.5 million acres owned by small forest landowners like you, like myself. I have 15 acres over here. I live about over here. There are different areas of concentration of the 215,000, it's actually 217,000, there's more, these small forest lands, and they tend to be down here in Southwest Washington. There is a strip up there in Clallam County, kind of from, the Kitsap and Port Townsend, Quilcene out to PA, or excuse me, there it is, Point Angeles, and points west, and then it turns into industrial, tribal, and actually state land and forest service. So there's a lot of publicly or industrial owned forests farther west, but right in your little hot zone right there. And I bet you that's where a lot of the people listening in today are. So for those who just arrived, I'm Ken with the DNR, and we're talking about animal damage, and I'm in the introduction of where the small forest landowners are. Quite a few in the front of the Cascades, Snohomish, some in Skagit, Whatcom, but down here in Lewis County and Clark, there's a whole bunch of small forest landowners, and a whole bunch up here in Northeast, Stevens and Spokane in particular. So anyway, those are the people that I serve. Our program is, here's Matt right here, Matt Preventure. Julie's not with us, she retired, but this is what we do. We help people write their stewardship plans. We help people get cost shares, give you advice, and we work a lot with conservation districts and WSU Extension. So there's our contact. So that's who I am and what I do. And so what did you get yourself into here? Well, this is how we used to do it. Hopefully we'll do it again someday like this, where we can sit and look at each other and learn from each other. But for now, we're Zooming, and I compliment Jennifer for being a Zoom master. She set this thing up and has pulled it off really well so far. So let's talk about trees. Well, excuse me, a tree, we think of trees as being these, you know, intact, self-contained organisms, which they largely are, and, you know, beautiful things that we love to grow and utilize, et cetera, et cetera. But they have a certain number of adversaries, let's say. I don't call them enemies, that's a little bit overstated, but adversaries in the natural world that might want to eat them, like insects or certain mammals, with the beaver being pretty classic. And if our objective is to grow the tree to full size for whatever reason, watershed protection, forest product, habitat feature, then sometimes these animals are not necessarily our friends. So, but your wildlife damage on small forest lands is usually driven by the same set of critters, and I'll say something about that. And so what you have to do is look at the situation, define what the problem might be, if it is a problem, and then decide what you can do. So it's sort of like, you know, you assess, and you starting out, wildlife, I think it's so interesting that there's good wildlife and bad wildlife. Well, good wildlife can be like a deer, you know, in a certain circumstance. We can really enjoy how beautiful they are or hunt them or whatever, but they're suddenly bad when they take something from us. And that might be our plants. That might even be to scare us, you know, say like you might be afraid of of cougars, but good versus bad. And it might be the same animal. So like an eagle is generally good because they, eat dead salmon and they're regal and the symbol of our nation and everything. But if they happen to grab your little puppy dog out in the park or out on the spit, you would be very happy. So suddenly that eagle's taking something from you. So the categories of wildlife in regard to forestry, the forestry bads are usually deer or elk, voles, beaver, black bears, and they're animals that eat the desired trees and plants that we, have as our objective. So sometimes they're the same animal. So here we are in an animal damage circumstance, and how do you deal with it? Well, I said this earlier, but the first thing is to define the problem. It's like, what are they affecting? Are they eating a certain tree species, a certain size of tree? How are they affecting it? Are they biting it? Are they girdling it? And how much? This is a really important point. And how much could even be how much where, meaning is it a localized action or universal? How much damage is there? Is there really property damage, and what sort of damage? And I said that. So the what and how, and then once you've determined that there is a problem, you have to decide on a threshold for action, which could be to you, oh gosh, it's just I don't want any of them out there. Even if your threshold is not numerical, it could even be comfort. But once you've decided that you need to do something, then you have a series of options. So what kind of damage do you see? Is it a chewing like this one? This is a rabbit chewed on this one. Is it a tip bit off like this? Is it a girdling? Is it scuffing? What kind of damage? Because this is like being a detective, but the forensics of it will give you some significant clues to the who. Did it kill the tree? Say like this one right here was girdled and it killed that young Douglas fir. This one, same thing. This one was wound up being girdled. And this is an elk rub right there on a particular tree. So rodents, things like mice and voles and beavers and sort of things, they tend to chew. I mean, you think of rodents' teeth, they have sharp teeth on the top and the bottom. And if they nip something, it's like a scissors took it. It's like right across the top, for example. Deer and elk, a lot of people know this, but they don't have any upper incisors. So there's no teeth on their upper jaw plate in the front. There are in the bottom. So it's hard, though. Their palate is kind of hard, but they take their teeth, they grab it, and then they tear it. So a deer or an elk browse is usually kind of rough. Yeah, there you go. Whereas if a rabbit had done this, it would be really just a straight cut. So you got to look for clues. So you look for the type of clues to lead you to, knowing who it is. And frankly, if you had a lot of action, I didn't put this in there, but you could use trail cameras too, might be a good thing. So how do you assess if you had a situation where you thought, I really want to determine the level? Well, there's different ways you can do it. I mean, it depends on your stand condition. And many times we are looking at animal damage assessment control in early phases of getting a new stand going. So what is your desired stocking? Say like that young Douglas fir stand, which by the way is right outside of Forks, with a nice wildlife snag in the middle of it, which I always like to point out, is a really good example where if they were having a lot of damage, this might be a stand to do something with. So different ways you can do it. I mean, you could just do it walking around, and frankly, your own observations are plenty valid. You might take a few notes while you go. You might notice what type of damage it is and ask yourself, is that enough information just to walk about to determine if you need to do something? So you might decide to gather some data, and this would be, real, pretty intensive. But if you had a situation like this and you had some mortality and you knew you wanted to get the stand to say 200 trees per acre and you planted 400 or whatever the number was, you might do a series of little plots, which would be pretty simple to do. And if you wanted to take damage plots, and I always do this, I'm pointing at the screen as if you could see me. Then this is just an idea. You could do a 100-acre plot, which is 11.8 feet in radius, meaning a string. You could take a string, have a shovel works really good. Put the shovel in the ground, 11-foot string, and go around and count the trees. How many, either you could decide to count all the live trees, how many injured trees there are, how many dead trees are there. Do, I say 10 to 20 plots, more than 2, more than 5, so that it's scattered around the unit. Because if you had a situation like this where you were having mortality, you might actually want to have some data, to help you determine what your next steps would be. So let's talk about deer first, because it seems interesting to me that deer are one of the Jekyll and Hyde forestry critters. We love having them around. They're beautiful and everything. These are the 3 species in Washington. The whitetail and the muleys are east of the Cascades. The black-tailed deer is your local critter up there. Digress, interesting side note, but the black-tailed deer and the mule deer are actually the same species. Oticelius humunus, and the blacktail is considered a subspecies because it has different habits, different coloration, but they actually do interbreed across the Cascades, particularly in the South Cascades. And you do not have whitetails out there, but deer. So there they are. And they're browsers. So deer are not really grazers as much. They browse essentially on the shrub layer. They have certain plants they like better than others, and that changes with the season, really interestingly. But they're browsers. They eat shrubs, and they will also eat trees, particularly in the early season when a lot of the shrubs haven't leafed out. You see, think about the time when the deer are eating Douglas firs. It's about now, frankly, and so the timeliness of this webinar is good. Elk are mostly grazers. They eat grass. They're down there on the ground. They like open country, but they will browse too. But elk tend to be grazers, and their damage on trees is often different. But what we want to do is we want to keep them from eating the tips of the growing trees. So you know about the growth form of trees, that that leader right there, that long one, is going to be the middle of the tree as the cylinder expands going upward. So I'm sitting here moving my arms around as if you could see me, but the tree is laying on a layer of wood and going up and up and up. And if this is disrupted like that, then you got a problem. So the trick is to keep them from, now if they eat some of the side branches, well, so be it. The goal is to get the tree high enough that they can't reach it, because in general the deer and the elk don't stand on their back legs without being able, and the deer in particular, they can't, like, sometimes people will tell a story of they'll see a deer balancing on its back legs, but it's not a common browsing behavior, which means you just have to get that tip higher. Think about a place where you've seen a browse line, and it's probably about, head high, nose high. I'm 5'10", so somewhere right in there. So that's where you got to get the tip of the tree above. And these things are kind of a standard forestry tool, the Vexar tubes. I bet some of you have seen them. And you put them on a bamboo stake. If you do try this technique, use the long bamboo stakes, not the short ones, because, and this is Ron Monroe, rest his soul, he passed a few years ago, ace tree farmer over by Monroe. And he was pointing out that then you just move them up. As the tree gets taller, you move the thing up, and then when it reaches a certain height, supposedly they biodegrade in the sunlight, or you could cut it off of there, or pull. You don't want to pull it too much because you'll disrupt your tree. But here you go. Here's some that he has raised up, and we went out, walked around that day, and he was protecting the tips of his cedars from the abundant deer on the Crystal Lake tree farm. There you go. There's another good example. It's working right here. Doug Stinson was out, and he's got the long stakes, and he was protecting his recently planted trees of different species too. So that is one thing, is sometimes the deer won't bother certain species, but cedars and Doug firs in a plantation setting are pretty much fair game. Small landowners, and that, I think a lot of us are in this category. I have 15 acres, and this is my property on the right after we had a fire last year, 7 years ago, yeah. And these welded wire cages. So that's like just about the right height, single fence post or some kind of a post. And the deer can't like knock it over. And then you can use it again. I just think that's a really interesting thing there. This gentleman was doing cages with chicken wire, which I think it might be kind of soft, meaning like a deer or an elk or something could push through it. But that was his goal there. And I think he was planting some cherries. So here we are with another, sorry about that. If you could hear that, that was my phone. I meant to turn it off. So this is one, this gentleman, Bob Takai, out by Spokane, he actually maintained that you could just make a brush pile around your little seedling, and he had had some success with that. So one of his tactics was to go out there and build a big brush pile right around the tree, which I think actually did work. Here's one that's pretty darn beefy, but this gentleman had a bunch of, what is that, chain link. And he used a logging cable and chain link. And I was thinking, you know, that would keep a bear off of that tree. So there you go. There's another fence. A lot of people will use repellents. Now, there's a problem with repellents, and that is that they get washed off by the sun, or maybe not the sun. What's that other stuff? Oh, rain, which you guys have a lot of out there. And if you miss, then your game's over. But in an ornamental setting, you know, they might actually work. And it's a little bit funny because you can go in the hardware store in any given town, and a measure of how many deer there are in that area is how many different varieties of deer repellents there are. It's kind of fun too when we work with landowners and we start talking to people about all the different, I call them folk remedies, that people try. And one classic is Irish Spring soap, hung from strings around, and apparently sometimes it works. There's been some people like they'll put a hot wire with little pieces of, some apple butter in a little tin hanging from the hot wire, and the goal is to get the deer to lick that. And the hot wire has flagging on it or something so the deer can see it. And once it's shocked once, it'll never go near that garden again. So I'm sure there's people in the audience here who have some folk remedy. I like to call it a folk remedy, which, you know, frankly, they can definitely work. But getting to go around the state, it's so interesting how, like, for example, in some places, Irish Spring won't work, in other places it will. So, you know, if you're going to try repellents, be creative and be consistent. So there you go. So deer also have this interesting physiology, which is, if you really start thinking about it, it's amazing that every year they grow a new set of antlers out of this basal tissue in the top of their head. And, you know, when you see a male deer's skull, there's a little bony plate right there. And they actually transfer calcium from other parts of their body literally into growing bones out of the top of their head. And this velvet is very sensitive. It's got a lot of blood vessels in it. And over the course of, let's see, right now, and I bet somebody's seen one, they should be just budding out. And by September or so, when they're headed towards breeding, the antlers are full size and they got to get rid of this velvet. And so what they do when they get into the fall, or actually like about September, they start looking for a place to rub that soft, tender tissue off of the bony core. So when you see the antlers like that, that's the core of that. And I once had a chance, and this was totally bizarre, but I think it was a hand-raised deer. I was up in the mountains. This deer like walked up to my truck, literally walked up to it, wanting to be petted. And I had a chance to pet a deer's velvet antlers, and he liked it. So he was like, oh, he's like a dog going, oh, that's so nice. So there's nerve endings in there too. And so when they're getting ready to shed, the blood vessels cut off, this tissue down here changes, and they got to rub that stuff off. And so I think it really itches, and they go looking for something to do this to. And so they do this in the early fall, prior to breeding, just as breeding is coming on. And you've seen this, and they'll usually pick a tree that they can whip around, something that's small enough that they can move it, and they want to be able to walk right up and push on it and kind of fight on it and everything. So if they can't get at it very good, they'll go pick another tree. One strategy for dealing with extensive rubbing is decide which trees they can have and deliberately make it easy for them where you can't see them and they're in the open. And so then last part is about now, or actually a little bit earlier, February, March, those antlers fall off. They shed. It could have been early. I don't know when they shed over in Clallam County. Somebody in the group can tell me. But they fall off and they lay on the forest floor, and rodents eat them. Squirrels, chipmunks will devour these things because they're a ready source of calcium. And that's why you actually, in really lush habitats like where you are, you hardly ever find a shed antler. So rubbing can be discouraged with things that keep the tree from moving, or I mean, frankly, simple armoring. So this was one on a tree farm on Whidbey where they had made it difficult for him to get at it, and he still kept doing it. So they put this, this is some of that, just drain pipe, and they split it down the side, which is a good thing. This is actually at my house. This is one of the trees I planted after the fire, and the trees got big enough that I took the cages off, and then the deer came in and started rubbing on a couple of them. So I put the cages back, but I put them like halfway around. Jennifer, is this a good spot to pause if anybody's got any questions about deer?
Yeah, I think if folks have any other questions about protecting seedlings against deer damage, this would be a good time. If you're not ready and you want to save them towards the end, that's fine too. If you want to, and also if you want to type your question into the chat box, I can kind of keep track of them, and then we can get to them at the end as well. So far, Ken, I haven't had any questions.
Okay.
So I guess let's just keep
Perfect.
through. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, thanks. Yes. Because the question of deer damage really boils down to either, well, no, we'll get to the last one. So there's two tactics right there. So there's kind of a special case, which you might be dealing with out there a little bit in Clallam County, is bear damage. And so black bears, which is our resident bear, have this occasional really interesting habit where in the early spring, like now, when the sap is rising and a lot of the other vegetation isn't out, they will damage trees. This is just kind of a reference. It's like, tell me it ain't so, Smokey. You're going out there eating my trees after all we've done for you. He says, no, what I done for you. Anyway, so the bear damage will show up in pole-sized stands, like not mature trees, not seedlings. But this stand right here had a bunch of bear damage that resulted in mortality. And so what do they do? Well, no, but sorry, I meant to throw this point out there first, that it's thought to be a learned behavior. That is, it's almost like culturally transferred from mothers to cubs, just of certain bears. Only certain bears know how to do this, because there will be places where this doesn't happen. And then there'll be another place where there's a whole bunch of it. And that's a really interesting mystery about how bear damage is transferred. So what they do is they strip the bark off and then eat the cambium with their teeth. So they take their lower teeth and they scrape it up the tree after they've torn the bark off to eat that sweet cambium in the early spring when there isn't much else around to eat. And so here's that tree's not as big as it looks, but my landowner here was obviously alarmed, and this is a mortality in a tree plantation. So what are the remedies? Well, there's really not very many, frankly. And so the feeding programs, they tried it for a while in parts of Western Washington. And so they would put out bear bait stations. And the idea was to give the bears something else to eat so they wouldn't go after the trees. And it actually worked to a certain point, but there was a couple of downsides to it. One obviously was expense. I mean, that's a lot of bear chow to be put. Now look at station number 60 on a Weyerhaeuser tree farm to protect an 8-inch Douglas fir tree in a stand that's probably overstocked anyway. And another one is that you actually were acclimating bears to eating human food. So you could have been training bears to go look for, dog food or whatever. And so, and an important thing to remember is if you're ever around bears, don't let them get food, because as soon as they're acclimated to food, if animal control is brought in, a fed bear is a dead bear. And so bear damage remedies do include killing of bears. Sometimes relocating and trapping, but oftentimes it'll be lethal removal with bear damage tags or hunters. But if you focused on a certain tree plantation trying to remove the bears lethally, how do you know you got the right bear? You might not, and frankly, it's a minority of bears that perform this behavior. So that's just a downside of that. You might be able to fence them out. If you had high value trees, but it would be so difficult and so cost prohibitive because often the bear damage is out there, in the tree plantations. You could read about bear damage. Washington Farm Forestry has written quite a few articles about it. Ken Miller, former president, has had a lot of issues with bear damage on the next to the Capitol Forest, and it's a conundrum. It really is. So bear damage, research it. We'll get to one idea on it. Beavers, our good old Castor canadensis is having a renaissance here in Washington. One thing that happened, well, two things. One, with the leg hold trapping change back in 1994, I believe it was. Well, and people aren't trapping anymore. There's not very many trappers out there, and just about every trapper that there is some kind of a commercial trapper. And I have to put in a plug for the ecological benefits of beavers, because indeed they create wetlands, they hold water back, create higher water tables. It's really interesting because particularly in dry climates, beavers do a lot of ecological positive work, and so if you can tolerate them, that's good. Here we go. They raise water tables. They make these totally cool wetland settings. Amazing little colonial creatures. Each beaver colony is one family group, so there will be usually a pair, last year's kids, and then this year's kids if they have them, and then sometimes there'll be adjacent colonies. But those youngsters, when they're year and a half old, they disperse. And so as the beaver populations have rebounded after long years of trapping, they're showing up pretty much everywhere. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah, then the lodge, the amazing, it's hollow inside. Their entrance is underwater. They've created this totally safe space. They live right there in the middle and nothing can get at them. So what kind of damage do you see from beavers? Well, usually this is it. They chew down cottonwoods and willows and sometimes cedars and Doug firs, and it's like, oh my gosh, there you go. And it's really frustrating, frankly, and for them to be this conundrum where they do environmental benefit while destroying the trees that we want. So here's your beaver remedies, and your remedies generally are mostly armoring of some sort. And so on trees with cages, that welded wire works good. You don't want to put it right against the tree because they can actually push it in, sometimes bite through it, which is amazing, and still get at the tree. This is they call it a beaver deceiver on a culvert. And this is really interesting because they can't get at the pipe. And beavers, by the way, love to use culverts as a starter dam. It's like, holy smokes, look at this. We got the perfect setting here. And so there's this organization, Beavers Northwest, whose mission is to help people deal with beavers and learn to live with them, and all sorts of good suggestions like that. Sometimes they will be relocated. All the trapping that's done these days is done with these live trap. Am I back? It says the host muted me. Copy. Let me go over here to chat. Can you hear me?
Sorry about that. Yeah. Hey, Ken, you should be up. Sorry about that. I accidentally hit your button when I was letting someone out of the waiting room. So you should be good to go now. I apologize.
Oh, no worries. Okay. I thought I did it. I've got a little weird thing on my headset here.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're keeping track of the questions, so I won't look at those. Okay, so yeah, beaver traps are now these suitcase traps. And beavers, I would say another little tidbit about them, that they're really, really olfactory. They live through their noses. They don't have really good eyesight. They're extremely good swimmers, so they stay in the water because they can get away from predators. But they mark their territories with scent. So they have these big scent glands back here, and they can tell everything about each other. They like communicate through their noses. And so if you put strange beaver scent right in the middle of one of these traps, set it on the edge of a beaver colony, you'll get them. You'll catch them every time. So that's Kent Woodruff in the Methow. They did a really interesting project where they relocated problem beavers from the low valley up into suitable sites in the mountains, and it kind of worked. It was pretty neat. So that's one tactic for dealing with beavers. So anyway, beaver's really interesting animal. Voles and rabbits, these are smaller rodents, and rabbits are actually lagomorphs, not rodents. But, this will often be chewing on smaller diameter trees. So there's a vole chew on a seedling. This is a vole. They're like a meadow mice. They like open country. There's about 8 species in Washington. 2 are deep forest. The rest are kind of grass country critters, and they can be a significant problem in chewing. Then there's their good old mountain beaver. Yes, the mountain beaver is a real animal. A similar circumstance. They live in these big burrows. This is a burrow system for one animal. So mountain beaver, Aplodontia rufa, or boomer, and yes, it is a real animal. There's one. They will make this burrow system that has one animal. Look at the whiskers on this thing. So, and the little teeny eyes. They live underground. They come out at night. You're lucky if you ever see one, but they come up on the surface. Look at the claws on that little rascal too. And that burrow system goes like 30 feet back and has different chambers for storing food, for pooping, for sleeping. They have to live near water. They don't swim. They're not a beaver. The mountain beaver moniker is incorrect. They're a totally unique animal, the only one of its genus in North America, and they do eat tree seedlings. So sometimes mountain beavers will be a problem in planted areas, but they mostly eat ferns. Sword ferns, one of their favorite food. So they're a real critter. Yeah, there you go. A Green River Community College, Green River College forestry program, their mascot is Rudy the boomer, and there he is himself with me. So rabbits, snowshoe hare, or cottontail. In some places, you might have cottontails out there in Clallam County. That's a question. Somebody answer that for me. But the mountain snowshoe hare, and they will chew young trees sometimes, and they're a little bit higher. It's a girdling like that up higher. Well, what do you do about chewing control? Well, here's one it's really simple. I like to advocate is make sure that you have perches that are strategically scattered around in your planted trees. And the bird that would help you here, the predator assist, would be mostly owls, but hawks can do it too. But just imagine a barred owl sitting right here at night and a vole walking around in the grass down here. So this can actually help. This was on a tree farm over by Southwest Washington, and the landowner indeed had put these about, 100 feet apart, which was probably more than they needed. But, along the edge, owls and hawks will perch in trees. So you may not have to do this unless it's quite a ways out. And so that's something I could suggest to you how far apart to put them, but I don't know, 50 yards, something like that. Then there's these little tubes. You can do these plastic, and this is the armoring again. This is a miniature version of that Vexar. And this is they're trying to forest a former little pasture here. They haven't controlled the grass up to the edge of the tube. They're trying it just with these tubes. And interestingly, in 2 years, they were successful so far. There was no mortality. So that's one way to do it. Oh yeah, here's your predator assist. You might get a nesting owl or kestrel or something with a bigger box near the edge of things. A lot of times, control tactics go straight to some kind of poison, some kind of chemical control, which can be very effective. It can be appropriate sometimes, but it's kind of like, it's like it's the last option if you got to do lethal control. Other ways are trapping. You can use live traps. You can use you're not supposed to use body gripping traps, but there are situations where people still use those squeeze traps on gophers and moles. I'll get to moles here in a second. And, and if you can see the animal that's causing you problems, say a ground squirrel or a marmot or something, shooting is actually an effective strategy. And I think really useful because you're targeting the animal. There it is. That's the one that's chewing on tree. But, a lot of these animals are nocturnal, and it's not really a very effective way. So I know it's just something to think about. If you do choose to use chemicals, follow the instructions closely, because most of them have, very specific methodologies. But the other problem with poisons is after, what do you call it? After catch. So something eats the poison, it goes and dies somewhere, and then something eats that. And even the anticoagulants, which are supposed to be non-toxic in a secondary sense, even the stronger versions of that can actually be toxic to a non-target animal, say an owl or something like that, some animal that it might be beneficial. So if you do go that route, be very careful how you do it. So here's one just thrown in. A lot of times people will see this kind of damage on a thin barked, often a hardwood, usually hardwood, sometimes on cedars. And this is a sap sucker. So this is a migratory type of woodpecker that makes these holes through the bark into the cambium, and the tree basically bleeds sap to try to plug up the hole, and the sap sucker comes along and eats it. And there's 2 different species in Washington, actually 3, but you have the red-breasted sap sucker. This is the one out there. And usually this does not kill the tree. A lot of people don't like it, but it's so interesting because this also is an early season food source. And I personally have seen Douglas squirrels lapping sap off of these, and hummingbirds will go and sip the sap off of there too. So, and insects too, like even butterflies will sip the sap. So that's who's doing that, sap suckers. Yeah, that's a red a red breasted sap sucker. Thank you. I kept wanting to say red name. You know, if you have a particular tree that you don't want that branch to die, which it can kill parts of trees. And I'm sure there's someone in the room here who has had either a tree or a part of, like a cherry tree. They love cherry trees. They love ornamentals because I think they have thin bark, frankly. So this lady put netting over and it worked. They quit bugging it. Moles. A lot of people don't like moles. A mole hole is down here, and they make cylindrical mounds, almost like a volcano, because look at the feet on this guy. And so moles, I mean, you can hardly even see their eyes. Talk about a remarkable underground set of adaptations, but they'll push the dirt straight up and they just keep pushing it out, and they eat invertebrates. They eat worms and different bugs under the ground. They don't eat plants. They're actually carnivores, which is so interesting. So this is more of a nuisance because of the dirt, but they're not damaging your trees. In fact, they may actually be benefiting the soil by aerating it. So moles are different. Porcupines, you know, porcupines, they're really rare anymore. And I don't know this for a fact, but for years, and I bet there's people in the room who heard about what do you call it? Control, even bounties on porcupines for years, because indeed porcupine is a chewing rodent, and they would often girdle the tops of trees. So there's a porcupine right there, and they would be way the heck up in the tree and would, you know, girdle the top of the tree because that's where they're eating the bark and the cambium. And so that's a porcupine girdle is up above the ground and it's big, and that's really the only critter that could have done that. Bears do it down here, rabbits and voles on little trees. So what are your options? Well, here's just kind of my summary. The first one is some kind of a barrier in a small scale landowner, you know, say with 5 acres, 10 acres, then you probably could do this. And this works both for herbivory, meaning you don't want them to eat the tips of the trees. Frankly, if they eat the side branches, so what? And for the rubbing. You know, if you decide that that's a tree you can't accept being rubbed. This is actually squirrels. Douglas squirrels will strip bark off of cedars in particular like this. Doesn't seem to hurt the tree. And they use that cedar bark to line their nest, which is just really interesting. So if you see this really fun, because it's not a deer, it's not a rub. It looks like the bark has been peeled off one strip at a time. And that's exactly what happened there. Different kind of repellents. They all work at different degrees, you know, and that's been a pretty fascinating discussion with people, is like which one works where. Predator assist, I mentioned the perch poles. Dogs barking, you know, frankly, you know, dogs that bark at the deer might chase them out of your yard, and maybe nest boxes, if you're lucky, you could get them. But you can try to encourage the predators that eat. Then your removal, and that includes poisoning, trapping, shooting. That's kind of your last resort. And if it's bad enough, you know, there are local services that help with that. It's not legal to relocate an animal off of your property, or well, you can take it to a property you have permission to. So that's a bit of an interesting dilemma. So a lot of people want to do something humane, say you trap the rabbit, and what do you do with it? Well, that's legal. So that wildlife, there's 3 legal categories, since I touched on legalities. The first one is the game or fur bearer, which are all managed by the state. And so like a deer, here's Hans with his first buck out in dry country, admittedly, but that was a legally taken deer during the season with a legal weapon. There's his tag attached to it. If you wanted to kill the deer that were eating your trees, you would have to get special dispensation from Fish and Wildlife. Rabbits are actually even a game species that has seasons, and raccoons too, and such for limits. There's unprotected species, possums, coyotes, voles, mice, skunks, and in most of the animals that are damaging your trees could either already be unprotected, say like the voles, or in a damaged situation, they could do that. Most wildlife is considered, quote, protected, that you can't take meaning kill, anytime. So like robins are a great example. Robins are a protected species. They're not a game species. They're protected, as are pretty much all of the native amphibians and reptiles, but that's not an issue for you. So there you go. So just that. So there's a guy, Dan Brenson, works for WDFW, and this is his job, is to deal with conflict and damage questions. So if you had something where you're like, God, I'm not sure if I can do a certain thing, call this guy. And I got his permission to give his information. Or, frankly, you could send me a note and I could bird dog it a little bit, or contact your regional Department of Fish and Wildlife office, which I think for you, is it in PA? It might be in Port Townsend, but yeah, they're in charge of that. So what about tolerance? Now, this is part of the reason you do an assessment. Can you put up with it? Because a lot of the damage is on seedlings. It's on little teeny trees, and we plant a lot of trees. If you plant 400 trees per acre and you're aiming to get to 200 and the voles eat 30, it might not actually be a problem. So figure out if you can tolerate it. And here's a really, really good website for animal damage information. So write this down. I think it'll be a recorded version, but it's like enter something damage management, and there you go. So Jennifer, I don't know how we can put that in the chat, but there you go. Yeah, so plant extra trees, consider the spacing. Like this bear damage stand here, when it was pointed out to me, it's like, well, shoot, it's ready for a thinning anyway. It looks like the bear did you a favor by spacing out. Now, I don't know how you could teach the bears to do it this strategically, but there you go. Yeah, because you were going to wind up thinning anyway. An awful lot of our Douglas fir stands really could use a thinning. So there you go. So just that, there's my kind of summary statement about tolerance. I always try to get to that because it may or may not be a problem. If it is, then there obviously are certain options, you can use. So different people gave me some photos. Dave Hauk from down in Grays County, my friends, my wife, Terry Piper. So thanks for the pictures there. We'll see you next time. I think I'm doing another one in 2 weeks. There is my email address. Yep, I work for the Department of Natural Resources, cover the whole state, work in the Forest Stewardship group. And it's excellent. 3:46. We got a few minutes for questions. So I'm going to.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you, Ken. And yes, we do have some questions here. So I think I'm just going to kind of go through them and see what you come up with. We have one participant that planted snowberry and thimbleberry. Sounds like they have a lot of deer in their neighborhood. And I'm just wondering if those will be targeted by the deer. And
Yes.
if so, if that's a problem.
Yes, they will be tolerated. Tolerated, sorry, nibbled on. Both of those are plants that deer like to eat. And if, it really depends how much availability of other food, because they might browse your plants a little bit where the plant still, gets size to it. But the rub is if they munch them down to nothing when they're really little, and the shrub never gets a chance to get, good root mass, because shrubs, most of the understory shrub species are actually adapted for browsing. So, you know, you think about when you prune back a bush and it doubles its branches. Well, that's an adaptation to browsing. So you might monitor that, Sharon, and if they start to eat on them, put a cage on them, get some of that hardware cloth, that welded wire, and make yourself so you just make a basket of it, you know, probably, I don't know, 18 inches in diameter, and put it over the tree or put it over the bush. So monitor that. That's a really good example of finding out if you have a problem. There you go.
Great. I have another question regarding beaver. This is actually something I'm interested in too, because we do a lot of restoration work along waterways. Are there trees that they're less likely to impact species-wise, or is everything kind of fair game with the beavers?
You know, that's a really interesting question, because pretty much at some level everything is fair game, but they don't eat Douglas firs very often, and they will eat alders, but they'll choose other species if they're available. So they really like cottonwood, willow, red osier dogwood. And so if there's like, I saw a wetland over near Mossy Rock, and it was an alder stand with these probably pretty good sized alders and a beaver wetland, and they didn't chew those alders. And I wondered if it was because the alders had gotten size to them, or because there was enough other stuff in there. There is an excellent little guide with that to answer that very question in Beavers Northwest website. So it's Beavers, I'll type it in here, beaversnorthwest.org.
Perfect. Yeah, I want to check that website out.
Yeah, check that out.
Yeah, thank you for that resource.
Yeah, and here's a great book called Eager. It's Eager. It's about beavers by Ben. God dang it. I got to think of his last name. Not Rosenthal, but Eager, The Secret Life of Beavers. Check that out. That's a really interesting book. I'll come up with this.
Thank you.
Yep.
So we have another question too. This is a great question on if you could elaborate on the difference between vole and mole damage. I think like what we normally see here, at least kind of in our field plantings, are voles, but then this thought that they had a lot of mounds like you showed with the mole. So maybe they're moles instead.
You know, that's really interesting, because I just was doing some research on moles, and it was pretty well emphasized that the moles are carnivores and they really don't damage trees per se. They might actually burrow through around the roots, but in general, so voles and moles will occupy the same site, and voles will also have underground tunnel systems, and the voles are herbivorous. The voles actually eat roots. Like if you ever got them in your garden, they'll eat your buddy carrots, and it's crazy making because you can't see their tunnels. Their tunnels are like probably that deep, like 3 or 4 inches, whereas a mole tunnel is deeper, and that's the voles are damaging the plants. The moles are more of a nuisance because of the mounds. Yeah.
Great. And then for protection on the girdling from the voles, do you find that the blue tree tubes, if installed like down to the base of the soil, that tends to be the best option, or do you have recommendations for? And again, these would be more like transitioning fields kind of into forest plots.
Yeah. You know, if you're trying to meaning establish a forest in a grassy area, the tubes are a pretty good try to get them started. And you also want to make sure that you scalp the turf back away from your plant by at least 12 inches, like, you know, do a scalping, because then the vole doesn't have anything to hide in to get over to it. So they do work. They're a little bit of a pain. And if like there are some, and Jennifer, I bet you've experienced this, there are some situations where you're worried about voles and deer, and there'll be these really tall, opaque tubes that are like 4 feet high, that are put all the way down to the ground. And I've heard of that being successful. So, yeah.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to read another one here from John, who's been working at getting a red osier dogwood thicket started for the last few years. Deer pruned them back the first year, so he put up a 7-foot high fence. 30-pound monofilament spaced 6 to 8 inches apart. After a year, somebody figured out it was only the filament, so we added electric at 18 and 30 inches. That's been working for about a year. Just added 50 more dogwood bare roots. So wondering what those deer will try to kill next.
I'm sorry, John, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at this kind of, remember Rube Goldberg with all the different ways he'd try to do stuff? And that's great. It's like, okay, I did this, then I did this. So yeah, look, the hot wire worked. If it worked, keep doing it. Okay, and there you go. And you have a few dogwoods outside the fence that are unprotected. Were the ones outside the fence naturals and not ones brought in from like a nursery? Because there's a phenomenon with planted cedars, and you may be bearing it out with dogwood too, that when you get nursery stock that comes from that really super duper good soil where they fertilized it, they'll eat those first. And I honestly think it has to do with the way they taste. And the wild stuff it's not as good. And so for whatever reason, maybe it's local adaptation. You're verifying a reason that if you can transplant from your property, there might be a good reason right there. So what will they try next? Let me know. I'm curious. That's good work, by the way, putting the hot wire with the monofilament. They cost a few bucks, but those deer buster fence, the kind of plastic mesh, those work pretty good.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so another question on deer protection methods. Will those work well for elk?
No, not necessarily. The tubes will, but if you get a herd of elk on your plantation, and they're determined, they're so bloody big that a exclosure like that John was doing probably would work for elk, the shock. So typically, yes, I've heard of the tubes actually working for the tips on elk. If you get I wondered, so I've heard people tell me about, they put the tubes out in elk country, which you have out there a lot of, and there'll be certain areas where the elk have just pulled them off of the tree, like literally. And I wonder if that's not like a certain animal, in the herd. It's like I'm sure it's a mom, has figured out, all right, here, throw that out. So yes, typically, yes, it's anything you can do that's a little bit beefier just because the elk are bigger.
Great, thanks. Okay, Jason has a question about if there's a wire that the beavers can't chew through for trees, or is that just kind of get too pricey to deal with?
Just that welded wire, and I guess they call it hardware cloth, that's got the little square that's like 2 inches by 4 inches. Mm-hmm. And I learned this from Beavers Northwest. You don't want to put it right on the tree. You want to put it out like 2 or 3 inches, and maybe go around twice. Because the beavers, you think about a beaver, they get up on their hind legs and they kind of push, and then they try to chew, and if they don't get some kind of purchase right away, they'll go somewhere else. And so you want to discourage them from that tree. And then it tends to work. Some people, I've heard of people using paint with sand in it. So there's these other ideas where you would like literally put gritty surface on the bottom of the tree, which supposedly is kind of like one of those folk remedies that works sometimes. My friend, the Beaver Maven that used to run the Beaver Project, he said, it doesn't work over time because they learn their way around it. So, yeah. So wire, and yes, but chicken wire can work, but sometimes I was told that unless you put multiple layers, it's too thin, that they can sometimes bite through it.
Okay, great. And John just followed up that he planted everything at the same time. So
interesting. John, I don't know. There's a mystery right there. I don't know. Interesting.
And I'm going to go ahead and try to unmute everybody. So if anybody else has questions, if you want to just unmute yourself, feel free to ask Ken, or if you want to type some in, that works as well. So this has been an excellent presentation, Ken. I've learned great tips and ideas, and we appreciate you spending your time with us this afternoon.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And, and tap into Matt Preventure and I watch for the coached planning class. If you have forest land and you're interested in writing a plan, or just, getting a little crash course in forestry, WSU Forestry Extension, here, I'll type this in there. If you've never been to their website, we also have a newsletter that's pretty cool. We have articles about all kinds of different stuff that comes out every 2 months, and we do one through Small Forest Landowner Office too. So I say we, meaning the conservation districts, WSU, DNR, we're kind of I don't know, a little teaching group, clearinghouse to help you do a better job, managing your forest. And our goal is to help people keep forest land in forest land. And I'm obviously particularly biased towards habitat quality, but I love working with small landowners because everybody is so dedicated, to do the right thing. And there's different ways to do all of this stuff. So, I just really appreciate the chance to share with you guys. And there's my email. So if you have some really cool animal story, or John, send me a picture of those dogwoods. That's a really interesting story because I'm always learning too. So, and Jennifer can attest to this, that part of our working world is it's two ways. It's just so interesting because there's so many angles, and we will find ourselves in the enviable position of having multiple observations, of similar efforts. And so we have the privilege of visiting your property or having you tell us, well, I tried it this way. So yeah, it's great stuff.
Fantastic. And as Ken mentioned, he's going to be joining us. Actually, it's going to be April 14th. And it's going to be his name of his presentation is Wildlife Habitat Management. If you build it, they will come. So kind of a flip talk about what you learned about today, but still very interesting. I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. This recording will be made available in the next day or two to everyone who signed up for the webinar series. And again, Ken, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.
So Jennifer, we're on April 14th.
Yes,
at the same time, correct?
Yep, 3 to 4 p.m. Yep, same time.
So as a plug for that presentation, that one emphasizes different habitat enhancement techniques that you can use to, bolster the wildlife on your property. So yeah, thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. Okay, everybody. Well, Jennifer, thanks for hosting me. And yeah, write down my email and hope to see you in coach planning class.
Sounds good. Thanks again, Ken. Have a good day.
Bye-bye,
Thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.